Hey, everybody. Welcome to Political Repression, Then and Now, a teach-in. And it's co-hosted by Historians for Peace and Democracy and Convergence Magazine. And it's co-sponsored by the Coalition for Action in Higher Education, Scholars for a New Deal in Higher Education, Brooklyn for Peace, the Zinn Education Project, and Manhattan Peace Action. And I'd especially like to also thank Stone Peterson, who is an organizer with Historians for Peace and Democracy. My name is Margaret Power, as you can see, and I am co-chair of Historians for Peace and Democracy. I will moderate the program this afternoon. I will briefly explain the format and then introduce our really outstanding speakers. We've asked the speakers to respond to 3 questions, and we'll spend roughly about 15 minutes on each question and then open it up to questions from you. One of the speakers will open the discussion for each of the 3 questions, and then the others will join in one different speaker. And if you would like to ask a question, please add it to the chat, and Van Goss, who's also co-chair of Historians for Peace and Democracy, will direct questions at the panelists. I'm really very sorry to say that Beverly Gage is unable to join us today for unforeseen circumstances that came up. And we hope she will join us in a future teach-in. I want to also call our attention to the egregious arrest of Palestinian activist and leader Mahmoud Nahil yesterday at Columbia University. We're going to be putting into the chat something that where you can write letters protesting this and demanding his immediate release. And okay, I'm going to introduce all 3 speakers at once and then turn it over to them. This is in alphabetical order. David Cole is the Honorable J. Mitchell Professor in Law and Public Policy at Georgetown and former National Legal Director of the ACLU including during the Trump regime. First term. He has published in both law journals and the popular press and authored or edited 10 books, 3 of which have won awards. Robin D.G. Kelley is a Gary B. Nash Professor of History at UCLA and a board member of the UCA Faculty Association. He is the author of 12 books. Ellen Schrecker is the preeminent historian of McCarthyism in the United States, higher education and academic freedom. She's a retired professor of history at Yeshiva University. She serves on the Historians for Peace and Democracy Steering Committee and is on the AAUP's Committee A on Academic Freedom. And Ellen is going to lead off the first question. And the first question is, what area of your scholarship on political repression helps us understand what is happening now? So sorry, just to repeat, she will lead off and then the others will join in and we'll sort of do a rotation of this for all 3 questions. So Ellen, you are on.
It's pretty obvious that my expertise in McCarthyism is relevant today. And in fact, every time since I've written for the past 40 years or so, whenever political repression rears its ugly head in this country, I'm besieged by calls from other scholars, journalists, all asking, how does this moment compare to McCarthyism? And usually I sort of say, well, it depends on the situation. Today, I can say what's happening today is much, much, much worse than whatever happened during the McCarthy period, which was pretty bad. But it was mainly focused on sanctioning individual, quote unquote, communists in accordance with a highly demonized notion of communism that spread, essentially attacked much of the American old left. And certainly its impact was to move the American political culture spectrum to the right. Today, the Trump-Musk regime is attacking the entire government. And so its impact on the rest of society is much, much greater than that of McCarthyism. But there are a lot of similarities, both, for example, of those episodes, McCarthyism and today, are assaulting our political freedom with the rationalizing it by defending against some kind of highly demonized enemy, an internal enemy, perhaps, the supposed red menace during the McCarthy period. And today it's kind of woke, quote unquote, woke culture and so-called anti-Semitism, which is really simply criticism of what Israel's doing today. But unlike political repression in many other societies, there's little violence or, at this point, criminal sanctions. Most of the sanctions are economic, and they're carried out by employers, both within the public and private sectors. So the lesson that we most need to learn from the 1950s is that the central role of mainstream institutions within American society, like universities, like local governments, like movie studios, like whatever private employer, are collaborating with the repression by justifying it, by legitimizing it, and by not fighting back. And so they are facilitating that repression, and they're doing this today. It's been ongoing in many parts of American society for years, decades, in fact, but no pushback of any kind that is valuable. And so what we're seeing, of course, is people censoring and self-censoring. I'm going to give you just one example of how that pushback occurred during McCarthyism, and then let's talk about pushback and not pushback, perhaps. There's an organization known as the AAU, or American Association of Universities. Very few people have heard of it, but it's rather powerful within the academic world, because its 71 members are the presidents of the main research universities in the United States. In other words, the brand name universities we all know of. And when, during the 1950s, it was founded in 1900, I think. During the 1950s, as McCarthyism targeted the universities, the leaders of the AAUP felt that there was a need for an overall general statement to deal with those professors who had once been in or near the party and were being called up by congressional committees. And many of them were going to take the Fifth Amendment to refuse to cooperate with the committees. And the only way you could do that was to take the Fifth Amendment, which essentially says you can remain silent if you're in danger of being prosecuted. And so what these people did in the AAU was devise a formula telling faculty members who might be called up that they had an obligation to protect their university's reputation. And they had, and I'm going to read this, above all, he owes his colleagues in the university complete candor and perfect integrity. What does candor mean? It means answering all of the committee's questions, including those of other people. And people who didn't want to be prosecuted for candor, but didn't want to be informers, took the Fifth. And they had, according to the AAU, a duty as a professor to speak out. Refusal to do so, on whatever legal grounds, cannot fail to reflect upon a profession that claims for itself the fullest freedom to speak and the maximum protection of that freedom available in our society. In this respect, invocation of the Fifth Amendment places upon a professor a heavy burden of proof of his fitness to hold a teaching position and lays upon his university an obligation to re-examine its qualifications for membership in its society. So what they're saying is, you take the Fifth Amendment and we'll fire you. This was collaboration in the most dreadful manner, and no wonder that professors were silenced.
Okay, thank you very much, Ellen. That was a great way to start off this discussion. And I'm not sure if David or Robin would like to jump in next.
Oh, I'll jump in. Yeah,
Okay.
and I'll give you the 60-second version. Basically, I spent the last 40 years writing about working class movements, usually, but not always, anti-capitalist, multiracial, often Black-led, and anti-fascist. And by fascist, I mean not just the classical fascism, but the kind of longue durée of fascism, which had its roots in the United States. So in the South, of course, the South functioned as a fascist regime, under what was considered the most liberal administration in history, the Roosevelt New Deal era. And of course, Ira Katznelson wrote about this. But the point I want to make, this is tied to the question of complicity, is tied to the question of collaboration. That is, there's no way that that the kind of repression would have worked without a certain level of white working class complicity or complacency. The level of repression would have been unsustainable. The same thing with patriarchy and with ableism. So I just want to mention that we sometimes sleep on the kind of quote unquote friendly fascism, the kind of soft authoritarianism rooted in white nationalism, patriotism, xenophobia, patriarchy, law and order discourse, personal responsibility, that whole idea against dependency, entitlements, welfare, anything beginning with the word public, right? And so forth. It recruits a portion of white working people, specifically cisgender, heterosexual white working people, to defend in the name of freedom and civilization against the other, right? And in doing so, they promote the expansion of a carceral state, limits on civil liberties, join the kind of ruling class attack on the social wage, with in other words, things that they need. So this is what we're up against sometimes. That is, what is the investment of certain people in this system when they actually don't benefit?
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. David?
Here, I'm not a historian. I'm a lawyer. I'm a constitutional lawyer. I've been a law professor for a very long time. And I've done civil liberties and civil rights law for my entire career, about 40 years. Most recently with the ACLU, I started about 10 days before Trump took office the first time around as the national legal director of the ACLU. So I've litigated a lot of these issues in a variety of contexts, and I've also written about them. I wrote a book called Enemy Aliens, Double Standards and Constitutional Freedoms in the War on Terrorism. I wrote another book called Engines of Liberty, How Citizen Activists Make Constitutional Law. Another book called Less Safe, Less Free, which was about the preemptive paradigm and how it undermines not only our freedoms, but ultimately our safety. And so in working on those books and in my litigation, I've really been focused on situations where the government faces some kind of external threat, or at least perceived external threat, a national security crisis. And in response to that national security crisis, comes down hard, uses broad authorities, often initially against immigrants, often on the argument that, well, they don't have the same rights as we do, but then they expand those authorities more broadly. And what strikes me about this moment that is so different from all of the other moments, I think, in our history where we have seen the executive branch overreach, is that the others all actually had some national security threat at their, inception. So it was, World War I, or it was the Palmer raids, which were a response to a series of terrorist bombings, or World War II, the Japanese internment in response to the war in a country that's fighting us, and killing many of our people. The Cold War and McCarthyism, the Communist Party, which was certainly seen as an external threat. The War on Terror, which was in response to the bombing or not the bombing, but the taking down of the Twin Towers and flying the plane into the Pentagon. I mean, these are serious threats, and there was overreaction. What's remarkable here is there's no threat. There's no serious threat. Trump sometimes talks about the border as an invasion, but that's kind of laughable. It's not a national security threat in any serious way. And about maybe 10% of what he is doing, even conceivably, connects to the border, and a huge amount of it is essentially not about national security, not about war, but about a culture war. And that is, to me, deeply troubling. That these kinds of it's one thing when you use these extraordinary measures in response to something that, at least in people think, imperils the nation. Here, he's using it in context where there is nothing that is imperiling the nation. He is imperiling the nation.
Okay, thank you. We're now going to go on to the second question. And the second question is, are there good examples of how to effectively resist authoritarianism and repression from either U.S. history or from other parts of the world? And David, you're going to lead off on this one.
Yeah. So there are so many examples, right? I mean, you can start with Lewis Post, who was the acting Secretary of Labor during the Palmer raids at a time when the Labor Department reviewed deportations, and he personally stepped in and overturned over 1,000 deportation orders coming out of the Palmer raids. He was brought up on impeachment charges or impeachment inquiry for doing so, but he stood up, pushed back, saved a lot of people, and was a hero. You could look at the university professors. Ellen was talking about the university professors. Many of them did go to the committee and asserted their Fifth Amendment rights. Some of them asserted their First Amendment rights and were willing to go to jail to stand up and push back, and ultimately built enough resistance that we were able to turn that thing around. You look at the civil rights protesters and the people who engage in sit-ins and other forms of civil disobedience, who went down to the South and risked their lives to fight for justice, which they ultimately achieved in, not in full, but in significant measures. And then the last example I'll give is the most recent one I wrote about in Engines of Liberty, was the response to Bush in the war on terror. Bush, when after 9/11, Bush had about an 85% approval rating. 85% approval, huge approval rating. He engaged in a really broad range of security measures, from torture to disappearances into black sites to warrantless collection of cell phone data on every American, to holding people at Guantanamo. But people pushed back. Civil society organizations pushed back, using international forums, using U.S. Forums, using the press, bringing in people like former generals to speak out against the torture. And by the time Bush left office, he had closed the black sites, he had stopped the torture, he had released over 500 people of the 750 who were held at Guantanamo. Bush released more people from Guantanamo than anyone else in response to this pressure, and had ended that warrantless collection of cell. So resistance, is there evidence of it? Absolutely. Does it work? Absolutely.
Great. Okay. Ellen, do you want to respond to this?
I wish I was as positive as David has been. I'm seeing such a collapse in and fear, because what's happening is so unprecedented. And I think we're not really ready to deal. What college presidents, for example, are doing is just being quiet. You know, the AAU still exists, 71 members, and none of them, I think, have spoken out directly. There's one college president, one, well, really two. One runs a small Catholic girls' college in Washington, D.C., and the other is the president of Wesleyan, which has a hefty endowment and does not do as much research as the scientific research as maybe other schools do, who are so seriously threatened. I mean, the threat is so enormous to take away the to impose a tiny cap on the funding for overhead costs, which has been shown to lose money anyhow for research grants in major universities. It cuts away the main funding of these organizations that have been struggling for money ever since the 60s, mind you, because there was a pullback in state funding after the 60s, in response to the 60s, that has never been restored. So what we're seeing actually is sort of the culmination of a major war against higher education. But it's also a major war against whatever racial progress has been made since 1954, you know, since Brown versus Board of Education. What we're seeing is just such a massive attack on civil society in the United States at this moment, that to think how much depends on Amy Coney Barrett, for example, to keep the Constitution alive is terrifying. So I would say that what we need is people who are willing to take risks and to engage in collective action, give up sort of our internal silos, move out, protest, begin to do civil disobedience, and perhaps, you know, bring certain activities of ordinary life to a halt in order to get that public sentiment to move the American people.
Okay, thank you, Robin.
Yes, yes, Ellen, I totally agree on all that. And to David's point, it's true. Bush released more, but then he also put more people in Guantanamo than any other president. So, you know, it's like 6 on one, half a dozen the other. So let me say a couple things. I mean, I think David gave a great overview of some really good examples. I'm less interested in specific examples because they always have to be understood in context, and they can't always be applicable to our moment. But I want to just raise two things. One has to do with the danger of appeasement. We cannot, historically and in the current moment, we cannot wait until an authoritarian regime is upon us to resist it. The most effective resistance historically to repressive and reactionary policies have been against liberal regimes. In other words, consider the free speech movement, for example, growing out of the opposition to the speaker ban, or, you know, think about the most militant anti-war and anti-police protests occurred during the Johnson administration and its so-called Great Society, you know, because keep in mind, it was Johnson that expanded and escalated the Vietnam War, you know, expanded and escalated all sorts of covert and overt operations, Indonesia, Dominican Republic, Brazil, Angola, Guinea-Bissau, Mozambique, and we can go on, and escalated the war on Black people in the cities. But what's interesting is that generation, by resisting liberalism, saw liberalism as a complete failure and then called for revolution, right? And so we can see that even in terms of the Obama years, where the the intense resistance against deportations, is during the Obama years. Opposed to Obama's deporting 3 million people by a second term, that number had been reduced significantly because of resistance. 1/3 of people deported under Obama in the first term had no criminal records of the 3 million deported. And then the other thing is that, in terms of police violence, the same thing. The Obama years is kind of the insurgency, the upsurge of Black Lives Matter. And it did make a difference. But what also made a difference, just like the Johnson years, is that people in these struggles realize that you cannot reform your way out of these things. It's a dead end. It's no accident that abolition takes off. It emerges, takes off during the Obama years, but during Trump years, of course, we could see it with spring 2020. But the last thing I just want to say is that, just a final point, and that is fascists and authoritarian regimes are always reactions or responses to mass movements. It's not the other way around. Working class insurgencies, the threat to capital, that's what gives rise to fascism. It's not like this some ambitious strong man hungry for power sitting around all brooding and somehow builds an arm. That just doesn't happen. And so if we remember that the reactions to our insurgencies, then it goes back to what Ellen said. We need to build, an insurgency and fight for the right for that insurgency to exist. And it will be very, very difficult, but not impossible.
Thank you again. And the third and last question, we should have probably flipped these questions, I'm thinking now, but oh well. Which parts of the current wave of repressive measures do you think are the most dangerous? And Robin, you're leading off.
Right. So, okay, it's a very hard question because parts make up a whole, So we're witnessing mass deportation, expanding police state, attack on organized labor, attack on education at all levels, attack on medical care, attack on the planet, on science, although they do back pseudoscience, namely eugenics, demolishing civil rights laws and institutions and agencies designed to address discrimination. And in fact, the elimination of DEIA not only criminalizes anti-racism and legalizes racism, but it is a Trojan horse for dismantling what's left of the regulatory state, an effort to restore and expand some form of apartheid, a direct assault on Black, Brown, Indigenous, queer, trans, non-binary, and disabled people. And so that's what we're up against. I just want to kind of zero in on one thing, and this has to do with the arrest of Mahmoud Khalil by ICE. People know the story already. He was apparently he had his green card revoked. He may be in Louisiana. No one's really clear yet. But the fact that ICE agents could come on campus and arrest a student at will without a warrant prepares the way for extending its mass deportation plans aimed at anyone who's undocumented. And that's one huge thing. The administration's decision to withhold $400 million from Columbia because of its alleged anti-Semitism from an administration that's the most anti-Semitic, which is true, administration probably at least in the last 70, 80 years, right? These actions, all of them, portend a general attack, right, on all protests, on all academic freedom, on all funding streams, and on all migrants. So they're not going to give that money back to Columbia no matter what they do. They could bend over backwards, they'll never get it because it's not about that. So we have to address the elephant in the room, and that is that the Biden administration and the university administrators who are already moving in this direction, that's part of the problem. Don't forget, Mamadou Tal, the doctoral student at Cornell, threatened with deportation because the administration suspended him for protesting genocide in Gaza, or just the general repression of nonviolent anti-war protests in the name of stamping out anti-Semitism, but really aimed at suppressing any criticism of Israel. This set up the repression we're dealing with right now. And we saw this coming. The financialization of higher education and reduced state responsibility not only generated unprecedented student debt, but it means that faculty and administrators are accountable to who? To trustees and donors. And that 71 people that Ellen talks about are part of that machine, not to the pursuit of knowledge. They're not accountable to social change. They're not accountable to the students. And the last point I want to make, which is crucial, because it explains like why our universities have become police states. My university spent $12 million over the course of a week to beat up students and destroy their encampment. I mean, that's where we are. So we can't always look at this as somehow a crisis that came out of nowhere because Trump won an election, right? So it goes back to my point about appeasement. You know, we're battling our own administrations that claim to be liberal, right? So I think this is the danger we're facing.
Okay, Ellen?
This has been building up for years. I mean, let's face it, universities, free speech, you think back to the early 20th century where there was a crackdown on anarchists. There has always been an undercurrent of repression, a dislike for defense, for dissent, a dislike for speaking out against the powers that be. But today's is worse. But I agree with Robin here that it's been building up he goes back to maybe Bush. I'm going back, to the Richard Nixon. This has been an attack on dissent from the left. Let's face it, this Me Too, both sidesism that sort of says, well, or it was in today's New York Times with David French. It was pretty bad. Yes, David French and I are on the same side against the crushing of dissent in universities today. But he seems to think that dissent is that the crushing had been just as bad from the left. That is a joke. Who has power? We're talking about power. And if we don't recognize that we have to mobilize to get that power now, before it's too late, before we're all going to be impoverished because the stock market is going to go and everybody's pensions are going to go and medical care is going to go. We have to mobilize now and stay mobilized and stay organized and make dissent mainstream it, say we are not going to cooperate with this and we're going to work together. We're not going to leave somebody who loses their green card hanging in the wind. We've got to defend everybody and just be clear that what's at stake is really, not just the future of American democracy, but the fate of the planet. It's really quite worthy of us getting off our butts and trying to do something day in and day out.
Thank you, Ellen. Okay, David.
Last sentence of Ellen's. It's worth us getting off our butts and standing up. So, to me, the what you see is really kind of two things from the Trump administration. One is targeting the most vulnerable, targeting immigrants, no right to vote, targeting trans folks, less than 1% of the American people, targeting DEI, which is a stand-in for minority groups, coupled with an effort to neutralize the opposition. And by the opposition, I mean opposition within the government and without the government. So within the government, he's put in loyalists in, the FBI and the Justice Department, in the Defense Department, the National Security. He's knocked out all the inspectors general. And what are the checks and potential checks outside that you need to neutralize? Well, it's civil society. It's the press, and he's gone after the press, CEG, the AP, going after the AP. It's the academy, and we've talked already about his targeting of the academy and using anti-Semitism as an excuse to do that. It's the nonprofit sector. They haven't yet been really targeted, but I very much suspect that they will be next. The professions. He's gone after, 2 law firms now in Washington, and basically in an openly retaliatory way said, we're going to take action against you, revoke your security clearances, not provide business. Why? Because you represented the Democrats, essentially. And so, that's what we're seeing, those 2. And, to my mind, what is critical, what will save us, and I do think we'll be saved. I'm not as pessimistic as I think my other 2 panelists here, but I think we'll be saved by civil society pushing back, and not necessarily in a revolutionary way, but in an evolutionary way, and through resistance. And we saw that the last time around, right? There was no revolution against Trump the last time around, but we did push back. We pushed back successfully. He left office, in shame with his tail behind, between his legs. He somehow, rose again. But there was a tremendous amount of resistance, and it really did neutralize. He lost more cases in the Supreme Court than any president since since FDR during the New Deal. And I think we can do that again. I think, we didn't see the Women's March this time around, but resistance is growing. Protests are growing on a daily basis. And that's what we need. We need individual acts of courage, collective acts of opposition. I would say to reclaim liberalism, not to reject liberalism as somehow the problem here, but to reclaim it against a very, very extreme anti-liberal, illiberal president.
Okay, great. So what's also good is their differences. So now what we're going to do is go to questions, and Van Goss is going to introduce the questions. We have 4 really good questions. So take it away, Van. Van, are you muted? Yes.
Now I'm unmuted. Hi, I'm Van Goss. I'm the co-chair of Historians for Peace and Democracy. I've been getting a lot out of hearing these fantastic speakers, and we have some really good questions. The first one is, and I think any of you may jump in on this, what are the main causes of Trump's rise and re-election?
Ooh.
Well, a lot of it is the failures of the Biden administration to deal with the issues that voters really cared about. And that was, of course, the economy. And by being diverted by the culture wars, which have been ongoing for decades, and refusing to be candid about what the real problems are in this society. The main one, besides racism, which I think underlies almost all of the opposition that built up. But the main one is really the growth of inequality, economic inequality in this society, and the fact that ordinary people are not better off than they were, and that the Biden administration refused to admit that, and diverted attention, and the Trump people took advantage of it.
Right. I would just add two really, really quick things. Exactly. And I think, I guess this speaks to David's point about liberalism. I mean, Democratic Party pivoted to the right to try to win this election. They tried to recruit Republicans rather than actually deal with their base, right? And that is a problem of liberalism. So if you're going to reclaim liberalism, reclaim it from the Democratic Party, whatever that means. But the other thing is that, racism has a lot to do with it. I'm not saying it's everything, but it has a lot to do with it because it's not just racism as anti-Blackness, but racism that actually generates a kind of deportation mentality, which is tied to a kind of white nationalism that's emerging. And the thing is, you got to understand January 6th as a response to spring 2020, right? Once you understand that, then everyone in my group knew Trump was going to win because of the way the Democratic Party moves and the way that liberals move, right? So I think that was a huge part of it.
And I think I agree entirely that the great divide between the wealthy and the poor is the fundamental problem in our society today, and it's really actually pretty hard to address. I don't criticize Biden for not trying to address it. I actually thought he did a tremendous amount to try to address it, but it's deep. It goes beyond our borders. It's very hard to actually give people meaningful jobs in places in many parts of this country. And he did actually invest a huge amount of money, more money than probably any prior precedent, in part because of all the COVID relief stuff, and nonetheless wasn't able to make sufficient progress on it. And I think that's in part because we have basically a dysfunctional government. As long as we're highly polarized, and as long as to get anything passed through Congress, you have to have a cross-party agreement. And as long as the Supreme Court is going to limit how much the executive branch can do on its own without congressional buy-in, you're going to have ineffectual governance. And so I think we're going to have a series of one-term elections. I'm quite confident that Trump will lose the next time around and the Democrat will win, and that Democrat will be in for one term, and then a Republican will win, and then a Democrat, because you can't govern effectively in our society with our constitutional structure of government, given the kind of strong partisan divide that we currently have. And that's what we ultimately have to figure out how to fix, either the constitutional structure or the partisan divide.
Okay, the next question is, what are the main causes of the United States and global shift to the far right, which is certainly global?
I would say again the same. This huge, the huge gap between the rich and the poor, and it's more and more evident to people given the way we all can see what everybody else has, and social media has meant that it can be exemplified and can be opportunistically taken advantage of. So that's my sense. I think it's also there's anti-immigration is not something unique to the United States. Every country is anti-immigrant because there's this sense of this feeling of scarcity, and I think it's partly because of the divide between the wealthy and the poor, and it's also significantly because, although more subconsciously, because of climate change. I mean, we're in a period of scarcity, and so we are afraid, and we're afraid of. Who are we afraid of? We're afraid of those that threaten to take what we have, immigrants. And again, I would not condemn the Republicans or the Democrats. It is a worldwide phenomenon.
All right. The next question that I had was specific. Oh, wait. I'm sorry. Yes, I'm sure. Does anyone else want to answer this question about the global shift to the far right?
Oh, I just add that the question of inequality is produced. It's not necessarily like just a result of nothing. Neoliberal policies across the board, including the BRICS countries, and the realignment that we've witnessed from Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, even in terms of certainly Argentina and other places. This is something that has this shift in the economy, in the global economy, goes back to 1970s and this is actually what we call neoliberalism. That is the complete attack on labor, the complete focus, the complete shrinking of the state, that is state, not state for purposes of capital, but state for purposes of providing, social needs. And this is the case in China as well. I mean, so we've seen this shift, which produced deep inequalities, and to govern that shift, you have to do two things. You have to generate mass support. Usually do that through xenophobia and other things. You also have to figure out a way to sharpen the system of repression, and do so in a way where people actually believe that they're freer. Wendy Brown writes about this when she talks about authoritarian freedom. And I think I would suggest reading her and reading Quinn Slobodian, who's actually explained this, I think, clearer than anyone. So I don't have to repeat it.
Okay, anyone else on this question of the global shift, or should we move on to another question? Well, okay, there's a question that was very specific to you, Robin, though others may want to add as well. Could you say more about the parallels today to the fascism of the South during the New Deal, or well, I think actually, during the New Deal and before the New Deal, over about 3 generations, I would say. Could you say more about that? What lessons we can learn from that?
Right, you're absolutely right. Many generations. I mean, after the defeat of Reconstruction, actually. Basically, I know time is really short, so the simple thing is that you're talking about a disfranchised population, disfranchised legally, and when I say legally, what I mean by that, they use all kinds of methods to deny Black people the franchise, and yet, as Du Bois reminds us, after the Civil War and with the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments, you actually get more representation in Congress from the South. There's no 3/5 compromise now. And so you have more Southerners, Southern congressmen and senators who have more seniority, who are running things in Washington, D.C., but doing so in the form of a kind of fascist oligarchy. And then they also built up support. The black shirts, for example, in Atlanta, Georgia, fascists, the Klan. I mean, you get emergence of a kind of racism, but the challenge to that, of course, were organizations like the Communist Party and labor organizing that really did challenge, Southern ruling class power. But they had to do it in a way to get the franchise. They had to do it in a way that would challenge the oligarchy, which is why so many people were killed trying to get the right to vote, like just shot down and killed. Some people were lynched for challenging just basic political power. And that to me is an example of fascism.
Okay. Well, here's a bit of a wild card question, but worth asking. Do any of you see there being another election, meaning in 26 and presumably 28 presidential election? Do you think there will be one? I mean, one that is, as fair as the last several. Okay, let's put it that way.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, I don't see any basis. I mean, I think people, I remember when after 9/11, and then there was the anthrax scare in DC, and people were worried about getting powdered substances in their mail. And my good friend Mari Matsuda said to me, in a crisis like this, there are 2 kinds of responses: panic or denial. And both of them are kind of irrational. But this one, and that's true, and and who knows which is right. But this one, the notion that there's not going to be an election, that's panic. The notion that the president is going to defy a Supreme Court order, I think that's also panic. I think we don't actually benefit from panicking. I think we benefit from focusing on the problems that actually face us at the moment and how we can effectively push back, fight back, and defend. And so support the organizations that are defending the rights that you believe in. There, something like 80 lawsuits have been filed. About 45 judgments have been issued against the Trump administration thus far. They have enjoined the DEI order. They've enjoined cutting off of lots of funding. They've enjoined the birthright citizenship. They've enjoined several of the anti-trans things. So let's focus on the fact that we can fight back, that there are real threats right here that we should be fighting back and organizing to do, and not sort of think, oh my God, what if there's no elect? What if the courts go away? What if Amy Coney Barrett doesn't rule for us? Amy Coney Barrett is not going to save us. We're going to save us. But we're only going to save us if we stand up, fight, speak out, and the like. So, I think it's great that we're having this teach-in, but I think the message is act. Don't, panic and get cynical and depressed and sit home. My favorite quote is a quote from a book on this issue, is a book by Cornel West and Roberto Unger. And in it, they say, hope is more the consequence of action than its cause. As the experience of the spectator favors fatalism, so the action of the agent produces hope. And so don't be a spectator. Don't favor fatalism. Be an agent and produce hope. It's not that if you're hopeful, you act. It's the other way around. If you act, you produce hope.
And I would suggest that action be a collective action. That I wrote a piece recently about it's not worth it to be a hero. Really, we don't need heroes. What we need are organized, ordinary people who are just saying no. So join an organization, have your book group become organized and sort of picket in front of Musk's automobile agency.
Tesla.
Yeah, the Tesla dealerships. Do something public, write letters, of course, and all that, but do it with a group. Join a group, become active in a group, and do it publicly. Don't just write a check. I mean, I wrote quite a lot of checks. We've all done that. But you've got to do more than that. You've got to put your body where your money is as well.
And I would suggest two groups: People Power, which is a group, a grassroots group organized by the ACLU, and Indivisible, which is a grassroots. Both of them are basically networks of locally based activists who come together to defend civil rights and civil liberties. And there's one in your community. You can join. You can create a new one. But those are two ways to do that.
Right. So if I could just weigh in on this question of, yes, to me, the question of whether or not there's election is not really a question. I think what I've been trying to say this whole teaching is that we have to take a longer view. We have a country formed as a settler colony that became a democracy basically after 1965, and then is actually declining. So we didn't even have a democracy before that. And I beg to differ. And by the way, I'm not cynical. I am not pessimistic. On the contrary, it means building power, but building power is not simply seeing the Trump administration as the emergency. In fact, let me read a quote, one of my favorite quotes from this guy named Walter Benjamin. And he says, the tradition of the oppressed teaches us that the state of emergency in which we live is not the exception, but the rule. That is to say, just normalized, and the task of our movement of the oppressed is to bring about a real state of emergency. That is to end normalization, right? To end the idea that the state of things are natural and logical, right? And then we have to get back to democracy. I'm not trying to get back to that democracy because we never had it, right? We have to do better than that. And I think, the sad thing is that, if Bernie Sanders had not been crushed by his own party and crushed by the media, he would have beat Trump. I put money on that. And I'm not saying that that Bernie Sanders is a savior either, but I do know that the kind of democracy that we're trying to get back to is not good enough. We need a democracy like what the UAW is talking about. We need a worker democracy. We need a democracy that actually brings people in, that refuses deportation, that refuses any kind of xenophobia. We need a democracy that actually will allow us as educators to do our job. And a lot of the repression that we're facing at the university was happening during my Biden administration, right? So,
Yeah.
I mean, I don't see like how we can go back to something as if somehow that's what that the state of emergency that was essentially seen as the exception, when actually it's always been the rule. We've been living under this for a long time, my whole life.
And I think it's dangerous to not draw very obvious distinctions between the Biden administration and the Trump administration, and to try to seek a broad tent. Which,
right, but I'm not. Just so you know, I'm not saying they're the same thing. What I'm saying is that there's a longer story to tell that ebbs and flows. That I'm not, because look, I've written enough to say that there's no way that they're the same thing. I was in Democracy Now! Saying the same thing. But what I'm saying is that there's a longer story. If we can't think of our history of democracy within 4-year chunks. There's some things that happened before that we have to pay attention to and struggle with. Yes, Biden's been probably the best president in terms of labor. I don't doubt that. But the condition of labor is still dismal, right? And I didn't say this before, but the war in Gaza has a lot to do with the defeat of Biden. A lot to do. And it's not because of the Arab vote. It's because of you waging a genocidal war and supporting it at all costs. And some people who are not even interested, lose interest as a result. I mean, to me, Biden's foreign policy with respect to Palestine is consistent with all those presidents before, and that also has undermined our democracy, right? And there's a relationship between what happened on our campus and foreign policy of the United States.
Okay, I'm going to step in here because of the time. And I just want to say, I think the best thing about a discussion is that you don't want it to end. And I don't want it to end, but this is what the time is that we said it would be. So I think, and just to reiterate what everybody has said, we need to act, we need to organize, and we need to do it together. And we in Historians for Peace and Democracy are an activist group of historians and historically minded people. You can find us on the web at Historians for Peace and Democracy. We're going to be doing future programs like this, and we are an active organization. I'd like to really, really thank Robin, David, and Ellen. This has been, as Van said, a really stimulating discussion, and not only stimulating, I think it's been a mobilizing discussion. I think you all have given us not just information about the past, but real strong arguments as to why we can be effective, we can work together, and we can produce change. So I'm just going to close it there, and I hope to see everybody again at future protests. And I just want to say, I live in Chicago, which many people know is a very cold city. About 6 weeks ago, there was a protest at Tesla. There were 10 people. This last weekend, there were 1,500 people. And I think that to me is sort of an example of, the opposition, the resistance is growing and will continue to grow. So thank you very much, and see you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Are we